This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Do we need this?
Yes.
Okay. We do. Okay. All right, Erin. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. My name is Sita Ranchad-Nielsen, and I direct the Institute for Developing Nations here at Emory. Over the years, we have focused a lot on gender-based violence and sexual violence, growing out of our connections with the Carter Center's Rule of Law program in Liberia. This has been since 2008. This semester, we've decided to focus on this in a series of events that is done in collaboration with the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies here at Emory, the Center for Women at Emory, and the Respect program here at Emory. And this is the fourth, and I'm sad to say, final event in the series. I'd say sad, like happy, sad occasion. I'm sad because I think the series has been very rich and helped to raise awareness about sexual violence and also to kind of deepen understanding about sexual violence. And that's been a good thing, and we've had a wonderful turnout for the films in the series. I'm happy because today we get to welcome Lauren Wolfe as the speaker to further our discussions and also share with us some of her current work, including work on sexual violence in Syria. I should say, before I get into Lauren's introduction, that all of the events in the series have dealt with sexual violence in graphic and specific terms. I want to say that I know that this is not a problem that happens everywhere else in the world. It happens all over in the world. If you have a kind of personal response or reaction to anything that you see here today and would like access to services to either talk about it or access to resources to help with it, please do let me know, let us know. We can provide you with access to those services. Now I want to welcome Lauren Wolfe. Lauren Wolfe is a journalist and an internationally recognized expert on sexual violence and conflict. She is director of the Women's Media Center's Women Under Siege project, an independent initiative that documents how rape and sexualized violence are used as tools of war and genocide throughout the 20th and 21st century, with a goal of deepening understanding of this and working towards a future where this is no longer part of future conflicts. Tonight, Ms. Wolfe is going to speak about sexual violence in Syria and also about a number, I think, of the themes that have come out throughout the series that have to do with everything from raising awareness to shattering stereotypes and concepts, pointing out progress that's been made in addressing sexual violence in conflict, but also pointing out the long road ahead because we're not at a point where we can say we are near this not being an issue in future conflicts, unfortunately. She's going to talk in more specific terms about Syria. And for those of you who follow her work and her blog, you know that she has written extensively on sexual violence in Syria. It's not an issue that is on the stories that end up on the top fold of the New York Times. Those tend to focus on the humanitarian crisis and the difficulty of getting peace negotiations, peace discussions started. But as her work and the work of the Women Under Siege project has pointed out, Sexual violence is woven through this conflict, and even though humanitarian aid and the negotiation process may be stalled, sexual violence continues to be reported, and they have a very interesting crowdsourced map that shows where the sexual violence is taking place and offers accounts of that violence as well. I know that all of you who made time to come out tonight share the commitment to understanding and preventing sexual violence, as well as a commitment to supporting the survivors. And in that spirit, please join me in welcoming Lauren Wolfe. You want to sit down?
Would it be all right if I sit down? Can you all see me? Let's see. Hi. Thank you so much. Thank you to Emery and to Sita and Judy and Stephanie and the people who brought me here, and to all of you for coming tonight. I wanted to start off a little bit by, a lot of what I'll be talking about is sort of from a media angle, because that's where I rest comfortably and really enjoy working. I'm a journalist by background. I sort of wandered my way into trauma stories by working at the New York Times on September 11th projects only. I found the really fun stuff to do. From there, I found myself wandering into any stories an editor said to me that would make the public cry. So from there, I went on and worked at a place called the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is an international press freedom organization. While I was there, one of our board members, Lara Logan, the CBS correspondent, was raped in Tahrir Square, February 2011. And that hit us all very hard because we know Lara personally. So the very next day, I wanted to do a story looking at what we had documented about rape in journalists, because this was sort of the first big incident we'd heard about. And I looked through our archives, and there were very few stories on the record. I mean, 3 or 4. I was told, by the organization that in the 30 years previous there had been other cases, but that they were kept quiet. So from there, I wrote a story that explained how little we had on the record. And within a half an hour, a journalist contacted me and said, I was sexually assaulted in Pakistan. That was within half an hour of it going online. And I thought, okay, there's something going on here we're not talking about. So from there, I undertook some larger research on that. That led me to the Women's Media Center and working for Gloria Steinem, who I'm sure I don't have to explain who she is to all of you, but she's an American feminist and a journalist, and she founded Ms. Magazine. So Gloria's idea was that if we could, she had read a book about rape in the Holocaust, specifically against Jewish women, and she thought to herself, if we could have known what we know now about what happened, could we have stopped what happened in Rwanda or Bosnia? Like, could we somehow study these things and figure out patterns and just, learn from them? So she wanted to start a project, and that's when I came in, and it became called Women Under Siege. How do I go ahead and advance this? Let's see. That was the end of the show, so we'll start at the beginning. Okay. How do I go full screen? Does anyone know that?
Our technical advisor will come and technical advisor.
Very bad at consulting, sorry.
You can use the clicker too.
Oh, clicker, sorry. Okay, so this is just an example. I'm just going to quickly run through what the project is. So we're documenting how rape is used as a tool of war around the world. We're also doing stories about things like the civil rights movement, and we're trying to connect what's going on in this country in terms of gender and sexualized violence with what happens in war zones. This is an example of one of the in-depth profiles we do. This one's on Darfur, and I chose it because that photo is by Lindsay Adario, the New York Times photographer, and I think it's incredibly beautiful. But what we've done is break down how sexualized violence is used as a tool of war, the patterns of violence, the numbers of women involved, the gender attitudes, and we've done this for multiple conflicts. So these are all the ones, I think we have 15 now, but you can see we're doing things that we consider war zones, such as Mexico, which I'm not even sure if it's on there, but hundreds, thousands of women have been killed, raped in the drug war. So really to start out, what I wanted to talk about was a little bit about how we view women in war, and civilians in particular, which women usually are in most conflict zones around the world. Interestingly, civilian fatalities have climbed from 5% at the turn of the century to about 15% during World War I, 65% by the end of World War II, to more than 90% in the wars of the 90s. So there are casualties right and left of civilians. Women are usually non-combatants, as I said, but we somehow don't keep track of what happens to them. We don't usually have numbers of women who are killed or raped, children who are killed or raped. We usually know battlefield numbers, soldiers who are killed. What we're trying to do is figure out right now in Syria, and I'll get to that soon, but can we count those numbers now, and can we quantify this along with qualifying it as horrible? Can we actually come to a kind of number as we go? This is a woman, also a photo by Lindsay Adario, a woman named Chiva Lanza, who, this was taken in 2008, she was 26 at the time. She was kidnapped in the Democratic Republic of Congo, held for 9 months in an underground hole in the forest, and raped and tortured. The reason I show this is because I think it's a really stark image, and I think it really shows us that we're dealing with something that is so deep, so horrible and painful. And I wanted to quote some statistics just to start out. If you know who Robin Morgan is, she's also an American feminist and author. She founded the Women's Media Center with Gloria Steinem and Jane Fonda. So you probably know who Jane Fonda is too. So from one of Robin's books, I recommend it highly. It's called The Demon Lover, and it gets to the roots of terrorism and why men commit acts of terrorism. So she says that women are 2/3 of all illiterates in the world, 90% of the refugees. Women contribute more than half of food production in the developing world, but our labor is not part of any growth index. Women are the majority of the 20 million people who die annually of hunger-related causes, and the 1 billion who endure chronic undernourishment and other deprivations of poverty. Our labor is erased because it's considered natural. We are homemakers, mothers, nuns. We work in factories, on farms, or in an office, and that's considered unskilled or kind of transient work. When it comes to rape and war, I just wanted to cite the fact that in the Holocaust, which I mentioned earlier, 0 people were tried for rape. In the Bosnian War, 50 to 60,000 women are estimated to have been raped, and only 28 men have been convicted for rape. 28 times. So these are kind of depressing ways to start out. But this is a photo of a friend of mine, an activist named Consoline Shimley. She's the tallest girl on the right, second from the right. And these are her brothers and sisters. This was taken 3 months before the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Her house was destroyed, that was on the steps of her house, and her brothers and sisters were killed. She was raped and infected with HIV. So she now, I mean, I'm having chills because it's a horrifying story, but she's doing really well, she's very healthy, she's in New York, and she speaks out all the time. So she's a really active, visible face, and I'm very proud to show her photo because I think it's really beautiful and very personal to show. So a lot of what I want to talk about is visibility and that choice of whether to show your face, use your name, and how the media portrays that, and how we go about deciding how to portray that. There's a series of choices in the words you use. For instance, ethnic cleansing. I don't know if you've spoken about this at all in this series, but ethnic cleansing, is usually a term used in genocide, but in our project we're using it when it applies to rape, in the sense when rape is used to either prevent pregnancy, forced abortions maybe, or forced sterilization, or when it's used to impregnate women, like in Bosnia, who were supposed to literally bear children that would have different faces of, the next generation, to show who the conquerors were. I mean, it's just that simple. You can see conquering horde faces of Mongolians traveling through, certain regions because those are the people who came through, and this is still happening today. So Gloria Steinem and I agreed on a definition of ethnic cleansing for our project. And her rationalization was that women have been raped to occupy inferior wombs with superior sperm. As I said, forced to have abortions or sterilization, as have men of inferior groups also, in order to end future reproduction. That's just one example of the nuanced language I think that you can use differently in a kind of, I do think that's a more nuanced level. When you're talking about the media itself, I'm sure you've seen the headlines where rape is called sex, nonstop. What was a woman who she gives a blowjob as opposed to was forced to perform an act. A lot of the language is very backward that the media uses. And I wanted to have a slide in here, but it's not here, so I'll just tell you quickly. A friend of mine named Amanda Lindhout, who was a journalist, was kidnapped in Somalia and held for 460 days. Her book is out right now. I really recommend it. I don't get money for recommending it. I just think it's fantastic. It's on the bestseller list. It's called A House in the Sky. So she was raped and tortured. She endured this alongside a Western colleague of hers too, he was Australian, she was Canadian. She has been raked over the coals since her release 3 years ago. Every time she speaks out in the media, she's never publicly talked about having been raped. It's now kind of out in the book. But every time she talks about her experience in any way, and let me just say, she's now created a foundation to go back to Somalia and help victims of violence, women. So she started an entire global foundation. She's so bravely re-entering the country that did this to her. She speaks out, inspiring women around the world. But the Huffington Post a couple months ago ran a story that said, chained, raped, starved, with her photo. Because she's also a very beautiful woman. So she gets men writing to her, incredibly angry at her, saying they would have held her forever and raped her till she died. I mean, I won't even repeat some of the things, but if you want to see, it's on our website. It's really disgusting. So just when I'm thinking about what the Western media is portraying with its language, I really love, there's a professor at Columbia named Helen Benedict in the journalism school, and she writes a lot about sexual violence in the military. She asks some really great questions, I think, about the media. She says, why is it that we in the media never cover how we teach our boys to rape? Why is it that we in the media never examine why so many men in our culture hate women? Why is it, even after some 40 years of feminist scholarship on rape, we still cover it as sex rather than violence? A journalist named Maria Hinojosa said, I interviewed her about this because she also covers a lot about femicide in Mexico and just rape in general. And her answer to this I thought was really interesting. She said, many men in senior editorial positions continue to see the story of violence against women as not important. Having been done, it's a story that has nothing new to offer. Violence against women is often reported as a one-time event, a horrific thing. But connecting the dots of the upward trend of violence against women is not something you see consistently in the media. So we're up against this, but we're also up against lack of interest from editors and readers of international coverage. And for instance, I went to Guatemala a couple years ago, and I came back and I have done some really up-close, in-depth reporting with survivors of rape from that 36-year conflict. And I pitched a story that I knew was good, and I won't name the outlet, but I was told, we had a story on women in Honduras a month ago. We can't take it. Yeah, speechless, right? So speaking of Guatemala, these are 3 of the women that I interviewed. They won't show their faces still, but they were all raped, and the reason they won't show it, it happened 30 years ago, I think, to each of them, but they never told their husbands because they know they would be kicked out of their houses. I think it was brave of them just to speak at all. But and just for a simple stat, 100,000 women are estimated to have been raped in Guatemala over this 36 years. Most of them Mayan women, because there was a real ethnic component to that conflict. The other thing that they're not just hiding from, it's not just being kicked out of their houses. They're also, well, before I get to that, there's also victim blaming that goes on, whether it's from their families or from the media. So one of the things I find really interesting about working at Women Under Siege is that I look at the analytics of who comes to the site, and maybe once a day someone comes there because they search on Google, are victims of rape to blame? I find that fascinating, and I hope that when they get to the site, they see that there are a lot of stories explaining why women who are raped are not to blame. But they'll also find information about how women are blamed mercilessly, From Mexico to Sudan, women who survive sexualized violence are not only forced out of their homes, they're divorced, they're killed in what are known as honor killings, even in places like Syria, which I'll say more about soon. In Burma, one woman who had been raped by soldiers, her husband said, prostitute, if you want to sell sex, we will build you a small hut in the jungle. You can sell sex there. Her own children said to her, whore, you are not our mother, don't come see us anymore. So in kind of a more accessible way, maybe you can look at India, because we're all talking about India. can see here, this is just one example, police inspectors who are saying, you know, you'll find girls who will do it there, they'll drink and have sex with you. I mean, just the attitudes, it's like you don't even have to scratch the surface very far to see this kind of talk among the police inspectors, among the judges, among the lawyers, you know, the very people who are supposed to be stopping this or speaking like this. The problem with that, like I said, is that women are literally dying from this kind of blame. It's not just hurtful, it's physically killing them. Women are committing suicide in Syria and other places. In 2011, a report in the Journal of the American Medical Association said that 35% of women in an Australian survey who had experienced gender-based violence later tried to commit suicide. So that's kind of coupled one way or the other with some kind of death, potentially. I think we need to reframe how we're talking about women's suffering in war, and we have to figure out a way to give an authentic voice to the victims and show their faces how they want to be shown. So just coming to Syria, the reason I talk about showing faces and representing people how they want to be represented, I think this is a really emblematic case of that. This is a woman who was lying in a hospital in Jordan, and her name is Alma, and I interviewed her via Skype. She was a former soldier in the Free Syrian Army, so she says. You know, I was unable to sort of prove that, but I was able to track some of the battalions and regiments she had talked about. She had been imprisoned twice, and she'd had her spine broken, so she's paralyzed now. The butt of a rifle had hit her, had hit her and broken her spine. While she was in prison, she was raped repeatedly. She was tortured, you know, hung by her wrists and hung, what is it called? It's called hung by her wrists, Shada? Yeah. So there's a name for it, even that kind of torture, and she experienced that. She'd been stuffed in a tire and beaten. I mean, just so much. And she said, you know, I've endured what I endured, but I'm not ashamed of it, and I want you to show my face and use my name. And I'm sitting on Skype in New York with her, and I had really wonderful people in the region who were going to the hospital, doing the translation, sneaking in the Skype, you know, camera, while the hospital administration was trying to kick them out, and there was a whole thing about a government official coming to the hospital and saying, you all have to stop this. Like, it was becoming very controversial. So these people were really brave in getting the story to me, who was doing the story in the Atlantic magazine, and getting it out. But then I was faced with this struggle of, do I show her face and do I use her name? And I spoke with her doctors, I spoke with her. I wanted to respect her, but I also knew that she had a husband who divorced her in Syria, and he had her children there. So every activist I spoke to said, you know, using her name will put her children at risk. It just will, because the stigma that comes with this is, you know, so intense that they could kill her children. You know, through various, I mean, I consulted every journalist I know who deals with this stuff, every human rights person I know. I just felt the weight of this very heavily. In the end, I chose to use her first name and middle name, and not her last name. And I struggled with not wanting to belittle her choice, that she wanted her name shown, used, I'm sorry. But I just felt that I didn't want to feel the responsibility of that necessarily, and that she was welcome to shout her name to someone else who could shout it. It just was a lot in the moment. I also chose to show this photo of her and not show her face, although I was advised that that was potentially less dangerous to show her face than use her full name. But you know, that's a difficult decision, I think, for journalists that I would prefer to err on the safer side of. I have photographers often approach me and say, you know, I took these amazing photos of women in a hospital in Afghanistan. They've all been raped. And they show them to me. They're absolutely beautiful photos. And this has happened more than once, strangely, in Afghanistan. And I would say, well, do the women understand that this might be published? Did you get their permission? And they would say, oh, yeah, no, I told them. I said, well, did they understand that it might be published online? Well, I don't know that their conception of the internet is so great, the person would say to me. And I would say, well, I understand you tried, and I understand that they said yes, but it's not something personally I'm comfortable with unless I'm face to face with that person and I clearly understand that their face will be shown around the world. But unfortunately, I don't think most of the media is so sensitive, so I think this is constantly a struggle, basically. So I just want to talk about the crowd map of sexualized violence. Let me see how I'm doing. I don't even know when I started, so I'm not sure how I'm doing. So This is, if you'd like to see this site, it's a separate URL that we're hosting through Ushahidi, which if you've heard of that, it's a crowdsourcing software free. So it's womenundersiegesyria.crowdmath.com. And when you come to the homepage, this is what you see. So you can see the different dots, the cases that we've gathered. Right now, I think there are about 220, but those encompass thousands of people, men, women, boys and girls. We're tracking all of it. One report will contain, say, 3 women who were tortured and raped. 100 people in the town were supposedly raped. That's the thing, most of these reports are not verified. They're rumor, a lot of them. A number of them are verified. What we're doing is putting it all out there right now with the sourcing, so it's very transparent, and we're hoping that we can solidify more of this information as we go. But for now, we're a central database of everything that's kind of being written and talked about. If it's too wild off the charts, I don't put it on there. But there are reports I've put on there that the Syrian government have broadcast of FSA soldiers raping, Free Syrian Army soldiers. And when your source is the Syrian government, it's kind of like, these men they parade on television look like they've been beaten, and they're confessing to crimes, and it's really hard to know what's a confession, what's a forced confession. And the same goes the other way when you see a video of a man who's holding up his former Syrian army badge, and he's saying, yes, I raped 10 women. I don't know, there's not a guy off to the side with a gun to his head. We just don't know with that kind of video, and that's a lot of what I think human rights reporters and journalists are up against at this stage with social media, with YouTube, things like that. Video verification is very hard. So just when you zoom in, you can get a better idea of geographically what's going on. This has been shifting over time. We had more reports in Homs, right in the center there. I've been seeing more reports now in the north as the fighting has intensified. So it kind of gives us a shifting idea of where the fighting is happening, where it's happening on the ground versus in the air. Are we getting reports of hand-to-hand killing and rape, or is it more just bombardment and it doesn't make this map? So that's been interesting to watch. This just shows you, so when you click through, they're not just numbers. You have a report that we've written up of each, and we categorize each one. This is in collaboration with Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. So we're working with epidemiologists who've come up with these categories that are very graphic, and you can't quite see them here, but you can see, sexualized violence without penetration, and then it's broken down by who did it. Was it the government? Was it the Shabiha, who were the plainclothes militia forces? Was it the Free Syrian Army? So we're trying to really nail down who the perpetrators are. The acts do get very specific. Was it vaginal or anal, forced entry? Was it groping? Was it this? Was it that? And then from there, each report is written like a journalistic article, hopefully, because I'm writing them all, so I'm trying to make them easy to read and accessible. But we have a team of people, so it's Columbia people, myself, and a number of really excellent volunteers who are Syrians who live outside the country and stay anonymous. So for instance, you can see on this report, this is about the sexual enslavement and torture of a 15-year-old girl. This was told to a Syrian expat and her husband who traveled to Jordan and met with rape survivors. They said that these women are living in a shelter, an apartment right now. The girl said she was detained and raped in an apartment for 10 days after her family was killed. She didn't know who the attackers were. She alleges that mice were inserted into her vagina. I've been following this story. We have about 4 reports now. This one came to us via Facebook. There were ones that have gone into Time magazine, I think the Daily Telegraph in the UK, and I've been following, and a couple of them are the same source, but a few of them aren't. And I've been trying to track down, this is such a horrifying situation, like could this really be happening, and could it be happening in more than one location? So this is the kind of thing that I think being a central database allows me to get a picture of, the strangeness of the reports. Could this really be true? How do they overlap? So this one is very interesting to me in particular because of the brutality and because of the sourcing and all of that. So from there, we're putting these into categories on the side that we're working with verifying. But for now, this is the way they're sitting publicly. So before I get more into the data, what we found, I wanted to put a more human face on the people who we're talking about. And I can't show you pictures of rape survivors from Syria because beyond Alma, they're not showing their faces. And I wouldn't show Alma's face. So What I wanted to do was show you, I've been in some refugee areas around Syria, and I wanted to show you some photos from there and talk you through not just the sexualized violence, but just the whole picture of what women and families are dealing with at this point. So this is Zatari. I took all these photos in May when I was there. This is in Jordan. I think it has almost 150,000 people at this point. When I was there, about 1,000 people were arriving every night across the border from Jordan. From Syria into Jordan. It was becoming a more and more entrenched city, which it really is at this point. It has electricity lines, it has shops. I don't think I really show those here, but yeah, you can see like this is a shop in the background. But the reason I'm showing this one, this was within an hour of my arrival. I met this young woman who was showing off her baby, but she told me that she's being physically abused by her husband, that he is living with another woman nearby who she calls a prostitute. I don't know if it's a prostitute or a second wife. So, it's a term you hear a lot, second wife, whatever that means in this context. But she said he would come home every couple of days and beat her. And, we talked about who she could report it to, whether she had reported it, and, she's terrified. And the thing is, the reason I wanted to show this is because she's just one of so many women suffering domestic violence in the refugee population of Syrians. From what I understand, I was told by a UN worker at Zatari that domestic violence in the camp was as bad as anything she'd ever seen in the worst internally displaced persons camp in Democratic Republic of Congo, where there was a live war like butting up to the IDP camp. The frustration levels are so high, basically, that men are unable to work. They're taking out their frustration on their wives. It's a really volatile situation for women. This is actually, I love this shot because this shows the bridal shop, the biggest one in the main strip of the camp. And you've probably heard about underage marriages going on at these camps. So I did a story for The Nation about these underage marriages. And what I found out, I went in there kind of, appalled by the whole thing, but my thinking really changed from being there. First of all, the girls are often married younger in rural parts of Syria as it is, as young as maybe 15, sometimes 14. So it's really a cultural thing that's come with them. But what's interesting is that the cultural part of that has kind of grabbed up more girls than it might have before, is what I'm understanding. Because I spoke to fathers who said, I'm marrying off my 14-year-old girl because I can't afford her right now. It's dangerous for her. I want her to have the protection of a husband. So this might be happening a little more, basically. But I thought it was interesting to see this because you also get an idea of the culture that in the background there's lingerie, and in the foreground there's a wedding dress, and that the two are often clashing, I think, in some part of this region, or in this region. This was a 15-year-old bride. I spent the day watching her get ready and get married to an 18-year-old Syrian at the camp. And what they did in the middle of the desert to make a wedding happen was pretty remarkable. But at the end of the day, her father cried. And I said, why are you crying? He said, because I don't want her to get married yet. I'm doing this because I want her to be protected. I need the money for my family because a bride price is paid by the husband's family. So this was her getting all made up. I would ask her and I would ask the other girls, do you want to get married? And, they kind of shyly go like, she was the one who seemed most like she wanted to. I mean, he was only 3 years older than her. He wasn't, 50-year-old Saudi man, which I heard those stories as well. I met young girls, 13, 14 years old, who'd already been married to men from the Gulf who were waiting to join them in Libya and Saudi Arabia. I mean, they were sitting in the camp. The men had, quote, married them, spent time with them, disappeared, and were supposedly getting them passports. I mean, who knows if they'll see these men again? There was one 13-year-old girl I heard about sitting in an apartment in Amman waiting to be shipped off to Saudi Arabia, and I contacted authorities and I tried to get her help, but I didn't know where she was. It was this, I knew her teacher didn't know where she was, but it's this kind of responsibility thing where even as a journalist, you're not, dead to the world and when a crime is taking place. I tried to stop it and couldn't. Just a couple more shots of this marriage. This was really interesting. I was there with a photographer, so that's just her she's taking a picture of the wedding contract, which ended up getting written in my reporter's notebook with my pen for a 15-year-old girl getting married. And what it said, it was just a financial statement. It was 150,000 Syrian lira, and you can marry my daughter, and if you get divorced, you pay another 150,000, and all the men in the room signed it, and there was a sheikh from a nearby town who came It was a little bit shocking, the whole thing, for a Westerner, but they were all very happy about it, and families were very happy about it. And this is her getting married. That's her father in the blue shirt, who was my age, and that was her husband in the white shirt. He was only 18. I wanted to talk also about the trauma that I saw. This is a drawing at the Syrian American Medical Society in Amman that a child did. They had a stack of drawings, and you can just see sort of some of the stuff that children are witnessing. The trauma I saw on children's faces, they didn't smile, they didn't blink, they didn't, they just had this mask very often, and often their mothers would too. And I would always be very careful about what kinds of questions I asked when children were in the room, and children are always in the room with the refugee families. They have a lot of children, and they all live in this, tiny, these tents or small refugee apartments. So I would start bringing up some sensitive stuff and often look at the mother, and I don't speak Arabic, so I have a translator. I'd say, do you want the children to leave? And they would just go, I saw my neighbor stabbed, I've heard my neighbor's baby was raped and killed. I mean, the things they would say to me with the children there, but the children would just, and the mothers would cry. It was just the worst thing I'd ever seen. You talked about getting help for anyone here who's heard horrible things. Like, I still need help. Like, you can't see this stuff up close and not feel just sort of ravaged by it. Which is why I need to keep talking about it, because I just feel like if you've seen this stuff, you need to share it. This was one of the girls who struck me the most. This was a slight smile she gave me, but this you can sort of see in her eyes. They're all suffering terrible illnesses with no medical help. They're suffering from psychological trauma with no psychological help. This was actually in southern Turkey in July, in a town called Reyhanli, which had experienced a bombing across the border so it's right across the border from Syria, but there was a huge 2 car bombings in May, so it became a very dangerous place for Syrian refugees for a while. But they go there because they have nowhere else to go. So they were living in this concrete house, and there were 70 to 80 of them crammed in, and I met with all the women and the girls, and they were just crowded around. This was a 14-year-old girl, and she was showing me the cuts on her hands because she picks cotton 12 hours a day for a neighboring Turkish farmer, because she has to support her family. So these kids aren't getting any education, they're working, they're suffering. This baby was born 2 days before I got there, and it was born in that house, with no doctors or anything. And the women just complained of back pains, because they all sort of, rip the discs in their back because they're giving birth under such terrible circumstances. And what I think is interesting too, you can see how they keep their belongings up on the wall. This is the house itself. You get an idea of where they are. This is actually the border of Syria, just driving from town to town, and you can see how close it is. There's a refugee camp in a place called Kilis in Turkey, and I wanted to go there, but they had tightened up restrictions on journalists and NGO workers because of that bombing I mentioned. So I wasn't able to get into the camp, but I was told that there was a public park where 4,000 Syrians were squatting, so I went to see that. And you have to imagine the heat was so intense, and I pull up, we get out, and this is what's going on there. And there are no actual structures, there's no UN involvement, there's no NGO overseeing it, and we were immediately rushed, myself and my colleagues and our translator and our fixer, and we had one man with us who was sort of standing off to the side, and people came at us, and I think I have a photo here. This woman was holding her child out, asking me to hold him, and he had scabies along his legs, which is a very contagious skin illness, and the conditions were just, you can see, horrifying. And at some point, they started saying, what are you here to give us? What can you tell us? Are we staying here? Is there another camp being built? They had all heard there was another refugee camp being built, besides Kilis, that was going to be a better kind of higher level camp with what they call caravans, which are not tents, like more structural cabins. And they came across the border, and there is no other camp, so this is where they are. And it became a fist fight around us with, the women were here, the men were closing in and yelling, and one man was defending us, saying they're journalists, they're not here to help, they're here to tell our stories, and a fight broke out, and we had to just kind of get out. You can barely I mean, the stench is so strong, the suffering is so strong, and it's an impossible situation that I understand why they would be yelling at us. Like we look like, well, not look like, we have so much more than they do. It's very hard to be there, but harder for them, obviously. This is just another structure that is really shocking. So just to talk about some of this trauma, I apologize, these are from March, but I have to say the last time we ran numbers a couple months ago, they were the same percentages, just by 1 or 2 points things are shifting. So these numbers are pretty reflective of what we have on the map currently. One of the more interesting things I think about the map is that we're tracking mental health consequences and physical health consequences, which are not things that are usually tracked in a live conflict. And this is also the first time anyone's ever tried to live crowd map something like rape in a war. So it's been a real experiment. You can see here that pregnancy, I think it's at nearly 4% of the cases. We've heard about, I met actually a hospital administrator in Turkey who had helped assist a young woman who'd been raped to get an abortion. I was approached to help a young woman in Syria now get an abortion because she'd been raped in prison. I'm not sure if she's here. There was supposed to be a colleague of mine, Yasar Kanawati, she's not here, but her son's here. And she's a psychiatrist working with the Syrian American Medical Society, and she told me about a woman, well, it was a family she met with. She was doing a home visit, and there were, if I remember correctly, 3 sisters, and I think there was a husband in the room and a father in the room. There were 2 children, and then there was a baby. And they were all crying, the women were all crying and saying that they'd been raped in front of the men, their family in the house during a home raid. The men refused to look up, it's just a strange situation, but you can't often isolate women from men in families like this, in situations like this. She finally just said, is that baby from the rape? Because the timing kind of worked out and nobody would answer her, nobody would look at her. So it's entirely possible these things are happening. I don't know if that was a baby from rape, but when you have rape, you have children. I think it's 5% of cases. Anxiety and depression, I mean, it's just when we clearly have someone exhibit or state that they have symptoms of that, we put it on here, but I'm positive it's much, much higher. Death, I think, is a really interesting category. We're tracking reports of people who are found dead with signs of sexualized violence, or people who are witness killed, or even committing suicide after sexualized violence. So there's a report on our map of a young girl who returned home after being in prison, who was reportedly raped and then reportedly jumped off her balcony and killed herself when she was 17 or 18. So again, like I said, these numbers are pretty consistent with what we've seen recently, which actually the epidemiologists at Columbia have told me is a good sign, because it means we might be catching something. If it's staying consistent percentage-wise, that could kind of indicate that we're catching something that's really happening and staying consistent. So you can see here that the largest percentage of reports involving women, almost 90%, involve rape. That's about 47%, I think, for men. You can see that we are trying to track when women and men are detained for the purposes of rape, trying to capture things like rape houses or rape camps like we saw in Bosnia. I have reports that I have published on the map, but I'm investigating further of actual houses where women are being held and raped that could potentially be called rape houses. It's very alarmist sounding, but in this war, it seems like anything is possible, and I'm trying to kind of figure out whether that's something I could do a big story on and say, these rape houses are happening, we're ignoring them, because we're ignoring everything that's going on in Syria at this point to some degree. Because I don't know that there's much we can do. But when we're looking at perpetrators, as I was saying before, you can see for men that it's over 90% of the perpetrators are government forces, and that's because more than 90% of the rape of men is happening in detention. So that kind of makes sense. When it comes to women overall, it's like 80-something% are government forces, Shabiha, the plainclothes militia forces, or both together. And the Shabiha are government aligned. So all of that is government. But I just want to say, people always say to me, you only have about 1% of your reports are Free Syrian Army. We do have a category of other that I think is like 17%. But when it comes to this, we're getting more information of atrocities from one side right now. it makes sense that it's coming, from one side that's pushing the information out, whereas the government is not doing as much of that. But I also just wanted to say it's entirely possible that state forces are carrying out the majority of the rape. The U.S. Institute of Peace, which is associated with this conference, they have done studies that show that government forces do perpetrate the majority of rape in most wars. So it's not entirely off the charts that this is possible. That happened in El Salvador, but in some conflicts, rebel groups and government forces, in Sierra Leone's war, they were rebel groups more so than government forces, sorry. So there are different breakdowns in different wars, but the majority are usually government. One thing that I think is interesting is we're looking to find some sort of smoking gun, because at this point you can't say that rape is being systematically ordered from the top in Syria. We have no evidence of that. We just know we're seeing patterns, we're looking for patterns. For instance, in reading every report I could ever find about rape in Syria, I've seen certain phrases repeated that men are saying as they rape women. They're saying, you want your freedom, here's your freedom. That's kind of interesting. Does that mean that they were taught to say that? I don't know. I mean, it could just be that that's the tenor of this war and that's the way people are speaking. But that kind of thing has been used in previous conflicts to kind of note whether the government has trained and ordered soldiers to do certain kinds of acts. This is actually, just back to Guatemala for a second, I wanted to show this because this is sort of the way that most cases have been built until now. This was in the National Archives, which if any of you get a chance to go there, it has 80 million pieces of paper that were found in an old warehouse that was locked away. It's the creepiest thing you've ever seen because it documents basically the atrocities of the war. It's internal memos between the security, government forces. They're going page by page, and if you heard about President Rios Montt, who was recently on trial, this is how they built a case against him partially. So they're trying to do that also for rape there, but this is a excruciating process. So we're trying to do something a little different at this point. I didn't know if I'd have time for this, but since I do, I just want to explain what this is a little bit, just back to Syria. I work with a group called Syria Tracker, and they are crowd mapping how everything besides sexualized violence in the war. They're doing a really excellent job and have tracked nearly 100,000 reports at this point of everything from murder to water contamination to disappearances. And I asked them to run a breakdown of women being killed. Because what's really interesting is now we're able to take this map of women killed, and this is again older, but we have a newer one, and we're trying to overlay it with our reports of rape and see where the violence is coinciding. And this is something that's really interesting to aid groups. If we can figure out where there's the most need, by overlaying these maps, what happened in these places, we can also start to build potentially an international case if there are ever going to be war crimes trials. Interestingly, so this shows across Syria, the average of percentage of women killed has been 9% of casualties. In Homs, you can see at this point in September 2012, it was 38%. So something happened in Homs. Why are women nearly half of the people being killed when women are non-combatants for the most part? It's kind of an interesting idea. This actually just shows a Syrian refugee whose, I believe it was her daughter, 16 years old. They fled because her classmates had been kidnapped, raped, and their bodies were found dead, so with signs of sexualized violence. And this wasn't taken by me. This was taken by an Italian photographer named Matilda Gattoni. I want to talk just briefly about what the law is and isn't doing for women internationally and what we might be able to do for Syrian women. Locally, governments have a lot of laws on the books about, you shouldn't rape, you get punished for rape, and all of that, but really the willpower is often not there. I was in Mexico City and I met with one of the two female Supreme Court justices, and she said, we have great laws, we just don't care about them and we don't enforce them. It's what I was showing you in India. When you have a conflict situation like this, there is no rule of law. The whole thing is broken down. So now really what do we do going forward in terms of Syria? The documentation I've been talking through is obviously the first part, and I work closely with UN investigators. I presented the information to the UN publicly. I've been asked by the UK Foreign Office, the State Department, they all kind of want to know this information. I think, well, I don't want to speculate about their reasons, but a lot of the reason has to do with the fact if there's going to be a war crimes trial, what is the evidence? Right now, I don't call any of our MAP reports evidence, I call it documentation. We're working, the Columbia Public Health people are working to verify the reports so that we can potentially call some of it evidence. Some of it is already because some of it comes from the UN, comes from Human Rights Watch, comes from people who verified those reports. I personally verified a few reports, but it's very, very difficult right now. When Syria's crisis was declared a civil war by the ICRC, that's the point at which rape can then be declared a war crime or a crime against humanity. So every one of these cases right now is a war crime. The Syrian government has been made aware that all of these cases are happening. They are legally, internationally responsible for investigating it. They're choosing not to. They're yelling back and saying it's not us, it's the other side doing it. And certainly you can see that reflected in the media at this point. Who are the Islamists, the Islamic rebels? Like, what are these people doing? What kinds of atrocities? And I think the focus is shifting off the government, and I think that's partly their propaganda as well. It's been like a pushing back and forth kind of thing. So again, what do we do with the information? There's never been an international trial of a leader based solely on rape. Charles Taylor was recently indicted partially on rape. There have been convictions, as I said, there were 28 in Bosnia, but it's a really slow process. I'm not sure that I hope that that's necessarily something that's going to come to bear in Syria, that we'll find justice for what's happened to all these people. But there is the potential for a tribunal to be set up. There is the potential for the ICC to take on the case, the International Criminal Court, but that can't happen unless the Security Council refers it, and that's not going to happen because Russia is blocking that vote for human rights to be referred over. So I don't really have an answer. I mean, all I can say is that we keep documenting it. We try to make everyone aware that these women haven't done anything wrong, that they shouldn't be condemned, that in a way they're heroes who've sacrificed for their country in the same way any soldier has, unwillingly, and that we should lift them up and honor them. And that's sort of where I'm at. I leave off at a very bleak point, and I'm sorry about that, but I would love to just talk with you and hear any ideas perhaps. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Ideas? Anyone have any ideas about us? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really liked the last thing you said about lifting these women up as heroes that they've sacrificed as much as the men have in the war. Do you have any suggestions about how you build that kind of will locally? How you build it from within a community and not have it be an external conversation about what people should do?
Yeah, one of the most interesting things I've been talking with a lot of activists about recently is the idea of connecting Syrian women with Bosnian women, because there was so much that was learned in that conflict, how to rebuild a country and how to rebuild, the gender divide and how, so many women raped, what do you do? Interestingly, after the Bosnian war, now I'm forgetting whether it was the prime minister, I think it was just really high-standing imams basically made announcements saying, honor these women, they've done nothing wrong. And that went a long way towards sort of shifting the culture from condemning to honoring. The same thing happened in Bangladesh. That was where it was the prime minister. In 1971, about 100,000 women are estimated to have been raped in that war in Bangladesh. And the prime minister said sort of a similar statement, and apparently that went over very well. And I think something similar can happen in Syria. It's got to be the cultural leaders who make that effort. It can't be the West coming in and saying, it can't be us saying it.
Hi, thank you. This was great. I worked in Bosnia and Herzegovina for many years during the conflict and post-conflict in Darfur, recently in Jordan, so this was very familiar. And I so respect what you're doing. I thank you for raising awareness around this, but nothing's changing. I'm listening to you about the imams in Bosnia. And I worked in villages where almost all the women were raped. I worked in Srebrenica. Nothing's changed. And that was so well documented. there's evidence, and to hear 28 people were tried, really? But what are we as internationals, and thank you media for raising awareness, but it's not enough.
No,
And I'm not criticizing
No, I don't
you,
think
but
it that way.
I'm so frustrated to hear
I know.
exactly the
That's sort of
same
what-
story in Syria that went on in these.
Well, you know, again, that's why Gloria kind of wanted to start the project. And
Yeah.
she said, why do we just have this repeating of history? It's just insane.
Same data, same.
You know, and at this point too, in Bosnia, women have received no reparations.
Nothing.
You know, they don't even get their houses back after all this time. I've heard stories of women who are forced to sit in court on the same bench next to the men accused of raping
And they
them.
have to face them.
Face to face.
And she has to be brave enough to say, you raped me.
Right, and I've even heard about men being released from prison in the towns where they rape the women,
Yeah.
where the women are living because they, you know, get a favor from a judge or something, and then they're back living next door to the people they raped. So it's a horrifying situation that I don't think the world is paying enough attention to be honest. I don't know, I mean, I hate to be, you know, the Debbie Downer of the situation, but I don't know the answer. For me, it's really about continuing to just speak and speak and speak as loudly as we can.
And hold our governments accountable.
Mhm.
I'm so ashamed of the British government around all.
Well, but you know the British government is actually, I think, doing more than any Western government at this point.
They are, but not enough.
Not enough, but when I went, actually, I was invited by the Foreign Office to go and present about Syria. And they had all these ambassadors and, you know, Red Cross and Amnesty, and like all these people in a room for days. And they did presentations on Liberia, Sierra Leone, you know, representatives from the country spoke all about rape. And I was the only person there to speak on Syria, and I was kind of like, hey, you know, this is happening now. And I gave a presentation, and everyone said, well, what do we do? And I said, here's an idea. I'm the journalist, you guys are the ambassadors and the diplomats. And I said, don't you have an idea of what we can do? And so they agreed to have a side meeting where we sat down, and there were Nobel Prize winners in the room, I mean, really smart people. And we came up with a list of recommendations that we gave to William Hague. You know, we followed up for months, and maybe one or two of them happened, and they were about how to exert international pressure on Russia. And, you know, we had a representative from NATO there, and she had certain ideas of how that can happen. You know, they were just about sort of supporting more humanitarian efforts, specific ones. It was just a lot of that. I know, it's the most frustrating thing. But what I always say is if we can't stop it, I don't know how to stop it, I'm not an international war strategist. I think at least we can focus on the psychological deficit of, you know, help. There's just no one there to help. There's one psychologist I met in southern Turkey who's like treating thousands and thousands of people, or barely treating. You know, I get calls from people saying, can you get this 14-year-old girl who can't leave her house because she was raped and is traumatized, can you get her a psychologist? And I spend like, you know, a few days like trying to get someone who can go there or Skype there. You know, support the Syrian American Medical Society. I think they're doing great work. There are organizations to support if you want to do something, but I don't have the answer for that.
Have you ever seen, speaking of things to do in terms of preventative measures, do you know of any organizations that have worked successfully on working on perspectives of women or masculine perspectives and working on changing that culture? Like I'm completely blanking the name of it, but there's a South American-based organization.
Sanki.
There's another one.
I love Sanki.
Yeah, I know Sanki, but there's another one that I was just talking to you about, and they work on men, like their whole focus on men, and working on the identities that men have, the identities of as a father, as a breadwinner, as a husband, and changing the identity of being associated with violence to, you know, being associated as more of a man. So I just wondering, have you ever seen like the outcomes of that, or have you seen programs that are working in that kind of stuff and making a difference in a community or in a conflict?
I think I've seen, at least in terms of Syria, I've seen men expressing appropriate outrage, and that's encouraging.
Yeah.
I haven't seen, I don't know of a particular men's group working on Syria, but Sanki together, they're excellent in South Africa. And they have something called the Men Engage Alliance they're part of. Maybe is that it? So they're doing great work. I'm just trying to think. I find it so frustrating that people are always talking about women's rights as if, like, I mean, there's like two men in this room. And I'm
Like,
I'm
it's associated with
irritated
men.
that other men don't show up to things like this. It's very strange to me that they don't think it has to do with them. So I really talk about women's rights as human rights, but it annoys me that we can't just talk about women's rights. It's like this endless, loop. But I think until we get everyone to understand that this is not just about women, that this is about families, it's about communities, it's social fabric that we're all part of. I mean, I don't know of specific efforts. I don't work for that area.
The organization is called Promundo, by the way.
Promundo, they're in Brazil, but they work with Santi.
Okay, that's why I knew the name Santi.
Yeah, and they just the two of them did a great study in Democratic Republic of Congo
That's what I was going to mention.
about attitudes of men.
Yeah.
And I actually had a slide I was going to show from this
And
study.
it talked about working in Middle East. That's what I what I know them from is that they're thinking about expanding to Middle East. But this was before the Syria war became the Syria war. And I was just wondering if you knew of anyone that had actually gotten a foothold in there before it started.
No, but I was just going to finish that study was really well done because basically they asked men, is it okay to rape your wife? And 34% said yes. I am making that number up, but I was going to show the slide.
I had a question about plans for a long-term commitment to this documentation, as you're calling it, and crowdsourcing, because I think that if you were to continue to be able to do this 5 years, 10 years out, I mean, the ability to capture sort of what you're getting at and talking about families is intergenerational effects. So I'm just really interested to hear kind of what the long-term commitment is to documenting in Syria.
In terms of Syria?
Yeah.
I've been asking myself that because this, organization started with one person, me, in February 2012. The crowd mapping started in March 2012. We built up a team, fortunately, with some really great people at Columbia, really excellent volunteers, but the whole project's volunteer. I have a salary from my job, the Columbia people have their salaries, the volunteers are not being paid. There's definite burnout that I'm sensing, and I've been thinking a lot about how to reinvigorate our team or whether to kind of add members maybe. The Syrian women on the team are doing all the translation of the videos. They're doing interviews in Arabic with people. The stuff they're looking at and hearing firsthand is about, their country. They have family there. It's really devastating, but I always say, are you okay to watch this video? Are you okay? Because I don't look at them. I won't look at a torture video if I don't absolutely have to. I was in a tent at Zatari the day of the wedding, and the father and all the men gathered me around. They said, look at this. And they started putting videos in my face of torture videos. What are you going to do in that situation? But in terms of our team, the women said to me, well, I'd rather do this because I feel like it's doing something. So every time I check with them, that's what they say. And our head epidemiologist is also a psychologist. So I have her, whenever I sense something weird might be happening, say, can you check with so-and-so? But, personally, I was just telling Sita that I felt pretty burned out, or I did burn out for a few months there. After these trips I showed you, I was having nightmares. I was having actual PTSD, and I think it's taken me a few months to personally kind of pulling back and recommitting, and, it's funny because you just brought up something that I was thinking. I was like, this project has no end, what do we do? I don't know. It's been a very kind of figure it out as we go kind of thing, so I don't have a plan yet. But maybe I should try thinking more.
I was just wondering how the women connect with each other, in terms of victim-wise, is there solidarity among them?
For Syrian women, women are barely talking at all. So, I would actually ask you because I know that, I don't know if you know a Swedish organization called Vina till Kvinna. My friend Eva, who heads it, so she did a lot of work in Bosnia, basically connecting women to women in groups like that, and I know it happened there.
There are a lot. My big experience around that was in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there were many women's groups, and a lot of them were unfortunately rape victims or in these rape houses, etc. So in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I did see that a lot post-war. And even now, I think there's some in existence. Darfur, absolutely not.
No.
No way.
But aren't women, am I wrong? I've heard cases of women in Darfur who've been cast out of their houses and told to go build a hut and live by themselves.
Yeah, in the most isolated areas of the camps in Yala and places.
Yeah, and I think Syrian women are too scared to say anything lest they be killed.
Yeah. I visited some female-headed households in Jordan, Syrian, and their husbands were still in Syria, and they couldn't even leave the houses because of the stigma. One, they're on their own anyway, but if there's rape cases in these houses, there's absolutely no way they're going to talk to other people.
That's another thing, the isolation though of the refugees, you know, they're also, there's a lot of discrimination happening too. Because in Jordan, as in Beirut, you get this sense that people are getting really angry that the Syrians are kind of flooding in, taking up apartments, rents are going up, prices are going up, there's a lot of resentment.
And the Iraqi refugees are still there.
And the
So-
Palestinians, it's just like
the
a endless
Palestinians, so
layer.
that's a big
Yeah.
challenge.
Going back to your example of the photographers in Afghanistan, I'm wondering about sensitive reporting and, you know, besides just changing the policy, like the APA guidelines, how much
There are no
information-
APA guidelines on rape because I've had people ask me.
Really?
There's a great researcher at Harvard who I guess I shouldn't name, I don't know if but she's doing really interesting work looking at guidelines. She's like, am I missing something? Is there something out there? You know, I've thought about writing something, but with everything else I'm doing, I don't really have the time to write, but I kind of want to. There is none. Like, you either go to journalism school or you don't. They don't teach you this in journalism school. You don't get handed a style guide about how to like ethically report that everyone uses. There are things that exist if you want to read them, but there's no standards. Sorry, what was your question?
Well, no, and the reason I thought about it is because the mental health reporting guidelines just changed. So there's a lot of
The mental health what?
mental health reporting, like how you report on issues of mental health, so using stigmatizing language. So I was just wondering if there had been anything on SGBB, because that was an area I'd heard any programming happening for the community of journalists in the media.
No, but you know, there are places like the Dart Center or the Augsburg Society, which I'm part of, that talk about this stuff. But it's almost like you have to seek it out as a journalist because there's no, I mean, it's kind of like you get to a newsroom and you either have a sensitive editor or you don't. You know, you either are a sensitive reporter in person or you aren't. I mean, it's funny because I talk to a lot of my conspiracy theorist friends about what is sort of inherent bias in the media, and I think this is just such an overlooked one. You know, gender bias, bias about sexualized violence. You know, how do we talk about rape? How do we present the evidence?
I don't know whether this is kind of within your purview, given the focus of the Women Under Siege project, but you are such an internationally kind of recognized
I think that just happened like
resource
today.
that I'm going to ask it anyway. And that there's a lot of attention on this issue in this country, in Atlanta. I've been to numerous events to kind of raise awareness about sexual violence and conflict. Most of them focused on somewhere kind of out there. Our colleague, who we know in common, has done work in Liberia and has, I think, at times been very critical about the role of international organizations as in dealing with gender-based violence, which is a high-profile issue in Liberia. When you look at the role of various international organizations, NGOs that are working in this area, you don't have to kind of name names, but I wonder if you can comment on some kind of trends and practices that you think are making a positive difference, and then perhaps other things you're concerned about.
Well, interestingly, I received a bit of pushback on this work about rape in Syria from an international NGO who, it's been a little bit on the sidelines, slightly public, where they say you're focusing too much on this because there are so many other terrible things happening to women. And when you look at NGOs, and my only NGO experience was the Committee to Protect Journalists. I haven't worked at like women's rights groups or things, but when you look at human rights, the pot of money is so small. And when you look at women's rights, it's like a tiny percentage of that. So I think there's a lot of infighting, from what I can tell. You know, I always thought journalists were backstabby and obnoxious, but I think NGO people are too. And if you want career advice, I just mean that there's a lot of competition, I think. And you know, if I'm busy getting rape in Syria into the headlines, which is I think where my specialty is to get the news, you know, that's what I'm focused on. I want to get the headlines changed. And if I'm doing well at that, and someone else would rather that I'm talking about whatever other issue, you know, I feel like there's been pushback. I can't tell if that's why. There's some concern that there's a disproportionate focus on one thing and not another thing. And I think it's literally coming down to the fact that there's funding that gets brought over. You know, on the other side of things, I think there are groups, you know, IRC, International Rescue Committee. I think they're doing great work documenting stuff. I don't want to name the negative ones. I've had negative experience where I'm, you know, in Beirut meeting with an international organization and they just kind of sit there and they have nothing to say because everything is so disorganized and it's sad. I don't know if I'm answering that question. I'm encouraged and I'm discouraged. I think it's a funny world, the international NGO world. I think there's a lot of glossy stuff that needs to happen to get the donors to give, and it's not always the stuff that needs to happen on the ground. You know, part of the criticism I was given was this is skewing money that will go toward supposed rape victims instead of domestic violence victims, or something like that, you know? I don't remember the exact thing it was supposed to go to. And then I asked everyone I knew in the region, I said, are you getting money? Are you getting money? Is there money for a rape rehab program here, or violence program? And they were all just like, there's no money. What are you talking about? So you know, I don't know. I think it's a very tricky, strange situation. And all I keep doing is just saying, you know what, this is happening, it's terrible, and I'm gonna talk about it. So I'm gonna let those people sort it out. Maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. But.
Do you ever get reports about intimate partner violence or like civilian rape cases, and do you have to consciously like put those aside and say, no, this is our criteria?
You mean in terms of Syria itself? Mm-hmm. I put a couple of them on the map on purpose because I thought it was really interesting to kind of note, but it doesn't go into our data. It's just
okay.
Noted. One of the things I didn't say that I wanted to say during the talk is, in Congo there was research done that showed that, I think it was in Congo, I don't know if that makes sense, because fighting officially ended 5 years ago, but it's still going. There's an increase in civilian rape, and it was, I want to say 17-fold, and stayed that high for a series of years. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly there, and I'm certainly trying to connect the dots between intimate partner violence, you know, and I think that Sankey Promondo study really did that, kind of shows the attitudes in the quote rape capital of the world, Congo, shows that the attitudes of men and the way they think about women and their bodies is pretty screwed up. So I think there's definitely a reason to keep looking.
I have a quick response to your question. I don't know of any programmatic work on working with men, but I do know that there's a researcher, Jocelyn Kelly, with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, who's done minimal work looking at men's perspectives in ex-combatant groups. So just one side note, and then a question. I'm curious, so you talked about ethical reporting, but I'm also curious about ethical interviewing. And you seem to, I really respect your sensitivity in taking or not showing pictures of survivors who talk to you, but I'm curious if there's a system in place, a protection system in place for them after they talk to you, if word gets out to community members or family members that they've talked to you, or if there's any follow-up on your end or with your team to see what happens to them after.
Well, I only go through organizations or activists who are already supporting someone like that. I don't sort of wander around until I find someone and target them. So there's already usually systems in place, or are systems in place. But I will say, when I was in southern Turkey, I didn't know I was there following in the footsteps of an international journalist. You may or may not know her name, and I'm not going to say it. But everywhere I went, everyone said, oh yeah, she came through and like made a mess. And it just was like this shocking thing to be going from like interview to interview and hearing that this person sort of trampled, like roughshod through the interviews, and that there was a young girl who was a rape survivor who would not speak to me because she felt so traumatized by speaking to that journalist. You know, people have weird ways of doing things, and I think culturally they're just not very sensitive sometimes. And you know, to be fair to this journalist, I don't know that anyone wouldn't have re-traumatized this poor girl. You know, you don't know what transpired in that room. But I was told she rushed the interview, and she made, you know, you've got to spend time before you go like, okay, tell me about your rape. And apparently that was the way she approached
There's several of us from the School of Public Health in the room tonight, so I'm curious about the inclusion of an epidemiologist and the partnership with the School of Public Health at Columbia, because epidemiologists track diseases, right? So thinking about this as sort of a disease and a physical affliction of Syria. So can you talk about how that partnership was established?
I've always been very bad about talking about the epidemiological end, so I can sort of pull from that a little bit and talk about the fact that we've also just joined up with the Public Health Migration and Refugee Population Program. I always forget what the full name of it is. But they're the people who've done, specifically looking at numbers of dead in Iraq. They kind of were very famous for doing that kind of study. They've done this with killed populations, but not raped populations. So they're interested in seeing what they can do at this point with that. And they put someone in the field who's been kind of going through our data with a sample grab, and she is trying to go case by case through that sample grab and figure out how strong those cases are. So they're doing things in a language I don't always understand, and I'm not sure I can translate it very well. But I like that we have the smart scientists on our side. There's someone in the back, yeah.
Getting back to Sita's point, I think international NGOs can do effective work in changing culture post-conflict, but it requires a couple of things. Obviously, sensitivity to that culture, because they're not of that culture. But secondly, going back specifically to the example of Liberia, there has to be strong political will on the part of the state. And you have in Liberia the first female head of state in Africa, somebody who, in all likelihood, was a victim of rape herself, and is willing to engage with men and women, but saying whatever you come up with, to suit the tradition, has to be consistent with national law, and there are strong national laws and international human rights standards. Without that, I don't think international NGOs or anybody else is going to get much traction.
You just made me think of something, and it applied to a couple of the questions. There's a group right now working through one of the opposition organizations in Syria called the Jasmine Tent. It's this project they're doing. I don't know details too much, but I was just reading about it, where they're, I think, setting up literal tents in refugee communities that are only for women, that are addressing all these issues. I don't know details, like I said, but it might be interesting to look up. Very interesting.
I just kind of wanted to come back to the point that you made earlier on the longevity of the project and burnout, and just in terms of like the documentation. I think the inherent use of data on any type of SGB or just violence in general, or any documentation of conflicts, the inherent value of that is that you have some sort of policy-making body to present that to. I mean, it's unfortunate that, as you said earlier, you attended this conference and you were the only one talking about Syria, because people tend to focus on Syria and Liberia or Rwanda. Not that any of these cases aren't worthy in retrospect. It's great to see justice done, but as you're saying, this initiative of tracking live data as it occurs and gathering that. In Sierra Leone and Liberia, there are specific branches of the government that have been created to address these issues and really get to the root of the causes and understand kind of the gender roles that led to kind of these cases of violence to permeate both during the conflict and in the post-conflict period. Do you see any type of willingness on any branch of the government in Syria to perhaps pick that up?
There's no branch of the government talking about anything having to do with human rights at this point. I would defer to the Syrians, but it's, I can get really angry too, but I won't. Sorry, I forgot what I was going to say to something you said about willingness on the ground. I don't know. I mean, there is an incredible, what I was going to say is there's a lot of controversy, though, surrounding doing this kind of documentation, because people feel like we are not as sure as when we look back at a conflict and know. But one thing that's interesting, I think, was in Bosnia, so 50 to 60,000 estimated rapes. That was actually Physicians for Human Rights' number, and the way they did that was they looked at the unexpected pregnancies during that time. And that's a really, that's a really weird way of doing something, because it's fraught with so many other things of, rape. I mean, it's not pregnancy necessarily from rape, but they did the best they could. But think about how flawed that was.
Sort of along the same line governance. So if Syria is not, the government of Syria is not doing anything, what's the UN's role in this? You mentioned it briefly at the end and how Russia was blocking it. Could you talk about that?
For any kind of referral to the International Criminal Court, you need the Security Council to do that. I think there's another way to do that as well, but the way that I know about it is the Security Council. There needs to be a vote, and Russia being allied with Syria, China being allied with Syria, Cuba, they're not going to vote for that.
What is the vote they could vote for?
I'm sorry?
What is the vote they could vote for?
They could vote to take these criminal cases, alleged criminal cases, and send them to the International Criminal Court. So we could open up court cases, but we can't because we won't do it.
So there's nothing the UN can do because of Russia?
I mean, you all know more about the UN probably than I do, and you all laugh along with me. But I mean, the UN is effective to a point, but when something like this happens, it's a stalemate, I think. And does anyone else have more information than I do? I think there's time for one more question.
Could you talk about how you secure your data, if that's a concern for you, and then how do you verify things, especially in Syria?
Secure it meaning so that nobody gets access to what I have behind the scenes. The really honest answer is that I don't get, my sensitive information involves contacts. I don't get reports randomly sent to me over the internet. We were worried about that people would crowdsource, send in stuff and not protect themselves. We have protocols on the site that we suggest people follow. We've gotten CrowdMap reports. They're not from victims. They appear to be like third hand, so we're not concerned. We haven't been concerned about that. We were at the beginning. We were terrified. We were going to do SMS reporting where you could actually text in a report, but I spoke to so many digital experts who just said, you know, you're dealing with a government potentially getting people's phone records. You know, those people don't know how to protect themselves, so we just didn't do that. You know, I use data encryption on everything I do. Activists in Syria, though, I swear to God, if they try to Facebook me one more time, I'm like, you know, it's the least encrypted. You know, I come from a journalist security background. It's just like the stupidest way to communicate, but they love Facebook. It's like the whole revolution is on Facebook. You know, even Skype is not that safe. People have breached Skype, but I do sometimes talk to people on Skype. You know, it's like you do the best you can, but I swear those people will just do anything to get the information to you. They're putting themselves at risk over and over. You try to like not put them at risk, but it's not always your choice.
And how to wrap this up? Thank you for the work that you do. You know, we are connected to the Carter Center and a number of programs that they run over there, and one of them is the mental health program that has a component that deals with journalists. And so we've been exposed to how difficult it is for journalists to report on conflict issues, and this issue in particular. So I want to thank you for your work and just acknowledge that here. I know that I kind of set you up, and I said, and now to wind up this series, you know,
I don't know
here's
if
Lauren
I
Wolfe, and it's not a Hollywood movie, and you know, perhaps it doesn't have kind of a positive ending at this point.
I tried. Once you said that, I thought I would
There's a lot of pressure, I know.
But there's the positive message is that you're all listening. We're talking about it. You know, media is. Oh wait, here's the best thing. I've gotten 3 calls from 3 different major media outlets out of the blue saying, I'm going to Congo, I want to cover rape, how do I do it better and sensitively? Or we want our paper to cover rape better and more sensitively, how do we do that? I mean, that's amazing. When you have like, I mean, literally CBS News. That's cool.
It is. That's really cool. And I'm also encouraged that through this series we've had so many people come out. Although the series is kind of officially closing because we ran out of money in our U.S. Institute for Peace grant, the Institute is certainly going to stay with this issue. I love how it's brought together people from the university, the CDC, NGOs, and we want to find a way to kind of continue focusing on this issue, and so I welcome your ideas, suggestions, input. You can go to our website and contact me through there. So, Lauren, thank you very, very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.